Our next presenter is Linda Moulton Howe, and she's been on Earth Files and Coast and been at this conference, I think, every year since the beginning. And she's one of the hallmarks of the Crash Retrieval Conference and an extremely good investigator. Let me tell you a little bit about Linda Moulton Howe. She graduated from Stanford University with a master's degree in communication. Linda has produced more than 300 live studio TV programs about science, medicine, and environmental issues, plus 24 TV documentaries, which include her Emmy Award-winning TV program, A Strange Harvest, which about worldwide animal mutilation mystery. Linda has written 4 books, An Alien Harvest, which investigates the worldwide animal mutilation phenomenon, Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 1 and 2, which report U.S. military intelligence and civilian testimonies about non-human intelligence that interact with Earth life. Her 4th book, Mysterious Lights in Crop Circles, researches unusual formations in cereal crops and grasses around the world, and includes videotapes, photographs, and eyewitness descriptions of mysterious small lights associated with crop formations. She is the original creator and supervising producer of the TV series Sightings and has been interviewed on Larry King Live, O'Reilly, Strange Universe, NBC's The Other Side, Montel Williams. She has also been featured on TV segments for the BBC TV, Union Pictures, the Discovery and Learning channels, and NBC Network special Mysterious Origins of Man. Linda also reports on science, environment, and the real X-Files news for her award-winning news websites, earthfiles.com and Coast to Coast AM. How many people have been to Earth Files? Virtually everyone, Linda. That's good news. How many people have signed up and paid and use Linda's site? Ooh, there's opportunity for growth there, Linda. All right, please help me welcome Miss Linda Howe.
Well, first, a thanks to Ryan Wood for persisting for 7 years in this conference, which I look at it now as trying to bring more facts to a phenomena that becomes so increasingly complex that we now talk in general conversation about non-humans, time travelers, and other dimensional interactions with Earth. And I believe that the fact that we are doing that in 2009 in general conversation shows how much we have come in terms of realizing that maybe we're not always dealing with just straight three-dimensional hardware. One of the most complex cases of the past 30 years occurred at England's Royal Air Force Bentwaters and Woodbridge bases, surrounded by Rendlesham Forest. After those mysterious events, this question remains. What exactly did happen when unidentified aerial lights, beams, and a triangular craft of unknown origin entered the forest repeatedly between December 26th after midnight and 5 a.m. on December 28, 1980, when at least 24 military personnel were involved? Only 4 months ago, Colonel Charles I. Halt, the man who was then the deputy base commander at RAF Bentwaters, went on the record in a June 25th press release to state,
The UFOs I saw were structured machines moving under intelligent control and were operating beyond the realm of anything I've ever seen before or since. I believe the objects I saw at close quarter were extraterrestrial in origin, and that the security services of both the United States and England were and have been complicit in trying to subvert the significance of what occurred at Rendlesham by use of well-practiced methods of disinformation.
I asked Colonel Halt to read his own statement in the press release just as a test. Is he comfortable? Is this what he really meant? And he said, absolutely. Colonel Halt served in Vietnam and Japan before being assigned as deputy base commander at RAF Bentwaters in 1980. His boss and base commander was Colonel Ted Conrad, who had not been on the job very long. Their boss was the wing commander of the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing at Bentwaters Woodbridge, Major General Gordon Edmund Williams. It is General Williams who allegedly received 35mm film in 2 canisters on December 30th, 1980 from RAF Bentwaters Captain and Day Shift Commander Mike Verano, who told Larry Warren and Peter Robbins, authors of Left at Eastgate, quote, "I did drive General Gordon Williams to an F-16 on the Bentwaters tarmac the morning of December 30th. He had 2 canisters of 35mm footage with him. He told me directly that it was actual footage of the UFOs on the ground," close quote, Captain Verano. It is assumed now that 35mm footage included the roll of 36 exposure black and white still film that Sergeant James Penniston says that he used in his camera to photograph the triangular craft on the ground in Rendlesham Forest in the early morning hours of December 26, 1980, the first of at least 3 nights in December 1980 of unusual phenomena in Rendlesham Forest. There was yet another event that took place on January 9th after those 3 nights, and I will be talking about that later on. Jim Penniston talked to me in September 2009 in an interview for Earth Files in Coast to Coast AM about the solid black triangle-shaped craft that he sketched and later touched. Before we hear his description of his own words, here is brief background about former RAF Bentwaters Staff Sergeant James W. Penniston. He was RAF Woodbridge Security Supervisor on December 26, 1980. He was 26 years old at the time and had been in the U.S. Air Force since 1973 after graduating from Freeport High School in Freeport, Illinois. His RAF Bentwaters Deputy Base Commander was Colonel Charles Halt. Not long after the clock changed to midnight after Christmas, Sergeant Penniston received a radio call from Central Security Control asking him to proceed to the RAF Woodbridge East Gate. There he was to contact his counterpart on the police side of military security, Law Enforcement Supervisor Staff Sergeant Bud Steffens. U.S. Air Force Police handle domestic issues and who is coming in and out of the base. U.S. Air Force Security protects the base perimeter, resources, and flight line operations. On December 26th, at least 14 security personnel and 6 Air Force policemen were working RAF Woodbridge. One of those Air Force policemen was Airman First Class John Burroughs, who reported to Sergeant Bud Steffens. When Staff Sergeant Jim Penniston arrived at the East Gate, Sergeant Steffens told him there was a problem in the Rendlesham Forest. Sergeant Penniston could see reddish-orange lights in the trees, assumed it was a crashed airplane on fire in the woods in the beginning, and asked Sergeant Steffens, when did it crash? But Sergeant Steffens said, "Jim, it did not crash, it landed." That puzzled Jim Penniston at that moment, and he decided that he must call the 81st Police Squadron Shift Commander, Lieutenant Fred Skip Baran, and ask for an eastern radar check. Lieutenant Baran told Sergeant Penniston there was an object over the base and that, quote, something had disappeared off radar, close quote. That convinced Shift Commander Lieutenant Baran to give Sergeant Penniston permission to go off base to investigate. And everyone that I have talked to concerning Bentwaters stresses the fact that on that first night of December 26th, Baran and others in charge were reluctant to go off base into civilian territory in the Rendlesham Forest, that we were U.S. Air Force in a base in England, and that forest where these lights were reported was civilian territory. And Bud Steffens and Baran were very concerned about allowing anybody to go off the base into the woods at that time. This is why there had to be permission for Sergeant Penniston to take anyone with him out into those woods. Sergeant Penniston asked Sergeant Steffens to go with him into the woods, but Steffens did not want to leave base property. So John Burroughs volunteered to join Sergeant Penniston along with another Airman First Class, Edward Kavansack. The three men traveled in a pickup truck from the east gate toward the fiery light in the forest. They drove as far as they could to the trees, parked and walked closer to the mysterious lights that were colored red, orange, blue with a little white. Their radios were interrupted by very unusual static. Central Security Control called for radio silence, and Sergeant Penniston asked Ed Kabansak to go back toward the truck and act as a radio relay because of all the static between Sergeant Penniston, Airman Burroughs, and Security Control. John Burroughs says recently that he has learned from their 81st Security Police Squadron shift commander that night, Lieutenant Fred Moran, that radio silence was called for because Security Control lost all communications with Sergeant Penniston and John Burroughs for about 45 minutes. Here is how retired Staff Sergeant Jim Penniston remembers the black triangular craft with a glassy surface in Rendlesham Forest that night on December 26, 1980 after midnight, and his own notice in his book, his notebook, that he could not account for 45 minutes.
It was a triangular craft. The fabric of the craft was black like glass, and then throughout the fabric of the craft there was some coloring varying from saucer shape to pie-shaped circles that moved around the craft. Some were red, blue, some yellow, or orange, I guess more orange. John is still with me, and I started taking observations in the notebook to coordinate the time I was there and what my actions were.
You are seeing what look like changing geometric patterns below the glass or above the glass?
Predominantly below the glass on the underside of the craft, and then occasionally moving around the upper side. It appeared that the coloring was part of the actual craft fabric. It made no sense. I've never seen anything that had that type of effect before.
Can you see through the black glass into the interior?
No, it was fully opaque. As we approached it, though, that's when I stepped off measurements of the craft. It measured approximately 9 feet long. That's 3 long steps with my stride, and approximately 6.5 feet tall. Occasionally, you would get some movement of color throughout the fabric of the craft. Sometimes a small glob that was probably 6 inches across, sometimes 12 inches across, but they were very sporadic color.
Circles that would change their size from something like 6 inches to maybe 12 inches when they moved over the surface of this dark black glass?
That is correct. It's hard to describe, but I think what stands out in my memory is the blackness of the craft. If you took an onyx stone and you had an onyx stone that measured 9 feet long and 6 feet high, that's what you would see.
Wow.
Yeah, to say the least. It was very unusual.
Were you thinking at that moment, this is not from Earth?
I knew that it was not from any form of government. I mean, no Air Force on Earth. It was beyond our capability.
Did you say to John Burroughs then, this looks like something from outer space?
I looked at John and I said, I don't know how in the hell we're going to explain this.
And do you remember what he said?
John says, we have a UFO here. I says, we have something here. I said, I got to have quiet here. I already paced it off. This is my second or third time I was walking around it, mainly in awe. Toward one side of the craft, there was markings on the craft, which were very unusual, probably 2.5, 3 feet wide. I was looking for a crew compartment or a window or something. I touched it, and the air temperature out there at the time was probably I don't know, 34 degrees, something like that. It was very warm to the touch. The temperature, I would say it was probably like 60 degrees.
And you were feeling heat and what else?
Smoothness of the craft, trying to figure it out. Feels like glass, but it can't be glass. It's got to be metal, but it felt like glass. I was confused at that point because nothing in my training prepared me for what was going on. As I felt my way around the craft, I came upon the symbols that were on the craft and gave them a lot more attention, feeling each one and then recording them in my notebook. If you had a sheet of smooth glass and you took a piece of sandpaper and you laid it on that glass, running from the glass to the sandpaper, that's how it felt.
Did you have anything come into your mind in terms of thought or image?
Well, did I feel intelligence? Yes. But here's something that is odd. I lost track of John for like 45 minutes or so. I don't know where he was at. There was like a 45-minute gap of time there, which seemed like, I don't know, a couple minutes. I don't know what caused the distortion.
When is your very next memory of John Burroughs?
When the light on the craft started to generate to a more white, brilliant light, is when I backed away from the craft. John was maybe 15 feet away, 20 feet away, standing there.
Because you were afraid of what was happening with this increasing light?
I wasn't sure what it was going to do. I don't know, explode, or the craft lifted off the forest floor, went to treetop level, and took off at extreme rate of speed, and John and I stood up. Nothing that I know of could be gone in a blink of an eye. I had this feeling, and the feeling was that there would be a return sometime of that craft. I don't know, it was just a very odd thought.
Jim Penniston told me that he and John Burroughs were debriefed after the dramatic events that morning by their 81st Security Police Squadron Shift Commander, Lieutenant Fred Moran. Later, both talked to Deputy Base Commander Charles Halt, who asked a lot of questions. The third debriefing was with RAF Bentwaters Base Commander Ted Conrad, who did not ask either Jim Penniston or John Burroughs a single question. That made Sergeant Penniston suspicious that his superior officer knew more about what had happened in Rendlesham Forest than either he or Burroughs knew, and they were the two who had faced this phenomenon directly. Even Deputy Base Commander Charles Halt became suspicious that he was being left out of the information loop by his superior officers, U.S. Air Force General Gordon Williams and U.S. Air Force General Robert Baisley, commander of the 3rd Air Force at RAF Mouton-Howe in England. But 4 years later, in 1984, Colonel Halt was promoted to RAF Bentwaters Base Commander, and he later also served as base commander at Kunsan Air Base in Korea. Later, he was director of the Inspections Directorate for the Department of Defense Inspector General. Charles Halt was born in 1940 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and is now 69 years old. He received a BA in Economics and Chemistry from West Virginia Wesleyan College in 1962, and a year later, on February 7, 1963, he enlisted in the U.S. Air Force. He was assigned to a school for maintenance engineering at Chanute Air Force Base in Illinois and became a U.S. Air Force maintenance officer for the next 17 years of his Air Force career. Colonel Halt retired from his professional U.S. Air Force career in 1991. Today, he is the equivalent of a mayor for a gated community in Stafford County, Virginia. 3 months ago, on August 18th, I interviewed Colonel Halt about his encounter on the night of December 28th, which is 2 nights after the December 26th first encounter between John Burroughs and Jim Penniston. And this was Colonel Halt describing a light beam coming down right in front of him and his investigating team. With him were Lieutenant Bruce England, Sergeant Monroe Nevels, who handled Geiger counters and disaster preparedness, Master Sergeant Bobby Ball, Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, and Airman First Class John Burroughs, who went out and ended up joining their team. John Burroughs and Adrian Bustinza both remember falling to the ground next to each other that night of the 28th. And here now is Colonel Halt describing what happened right in front of him and his own eyes.
The object stopped overhead and sent down a beam. The best way I can describe it is a laser beam, because the light did not radiate out like a light would do. It came straight down and fell at our feet, and we were quite concerned. The light was a very bright white light, probably 15, 20 inches in diameter when it hit the ground. It was right in front of us, less than 10 feet or 15 feet away.
What happened at that moment?
We stood there in awe. You know, is it a signal? Is it a warning? Is it a method of communication? What do we do? And we just stood there for, 5, 10 seconds, maybe 15 seconds, and it was gone. I mean, it disappeared as suddenly as it appeared. It was so shocking that, wow. At the same time, we were continuously having problems with our radios on all 3 frequencies we were on, picking up radio signals from the weapons storage area, and they were indicating that they were over there. We could see objects in the sky over there. And I've later learned that there were some technicians from Communications Squadron working in the tower, as well as the tower operator, that observed some very strange things as far as lights and objects.
Do you know for a fact with your own eyes that you were seeing a beam come down in the general area of the weapons storage area?
I could see something, yes.
So for those radio reports that were describing a beam coming from a light down into the weapons storage area, those would be other eyewitnesses who could see into the weapons storage area when you could not.
That's correct. There are multiple objects in the sky at that time, at least 4, if not 5 or more.
Were they all white?
No, they changed color. They changed shape from round to elliptical.
Colors?
Gosh, red, blue, and green, I think. When the thing went overhead and the light approached us, stopped overhead, and it sent a beam down. Oh, my God, we all went into shock almost. How am I ever going to explain this? Nobody's going to believe this. This is a kiss of death for my career.
The next morning of December 29th, 1980, Colonel Halt played his audio tape that probably a lot of you have heard now either on the internet or in TV documentaries that he had out in Rendlesham Forest on December 28th. And he played that audio tape in his own words telling me this for his boss, the wing commander of the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing at RAF Bentwaters in Woodbridge, Major General Gordon Edmund Williams. General Williams took the audio tape to Ramstein, Germany, U.S. Air Force and NATO headquarters for a weekly staff meeting on the next Wednesday. Leading the weekly meeting was U.S. Air Force General Robert Baisley, then commander of the 3rd Air Force at Royal Air Force Station Mouton-Howe, England. And General Baisley asked, well, what do we do? The consensus of the military officers in that meeting was to say, quote, it's a Brit affair. That happened off base, close quote. Therefore, nothing that happened in Rendlesham Forest was the responsibility of the U.S. Air Force. Colonel Halt told me that after General Williams returned to RAF Bentwaters, he laughed at Colonel Halt when he handed back the audio tape. And General Williams said to Colonel Halt, quote, Baisley said, it's a Brit affair, close quote, and laughed.
You knew that there was a credibility problem, but now, 30 years later, in the summer of 2009, you are going on the record saying that what you encountered at Rendlesham Forest near RAF Bentwaters and Woodbridge was of extraterrestrial origin. Can you explain today why you are clarifying that?
Because it was beyond the realm of anything we know, and it was intelligently controlled. Now, I will say one other thing. It's certainly possible, whatever it is, may be from another dimension. I thought of that at a later point, but it was beyond anything we know we had in place at the time, even experimentally. I mean, here's something that is too small for human habitation, that moves under intelligent control, that has the ability to change shape, and then multiple objects appear that have the capability to send down the equivalent of what I would say would be laser beams or something like that, and have a great deal of interest in what goes on at Bentwaters as far as the weapons storage area.
Colonel Halt, why do you think that 30 years after this event in Rendlesham Forest near RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, that the Ministry of Defense in the United Kingdom would pretend to release all of the Bentwaters documents when you, I, Nick Pope, and others know that they haven't released the meat at all?
I don't think they ever will. When I was on Larry King, he said, when do you think this will ever become public? I said, when one of them lands in Times Square or on the lawn in the White House and they can't deny it. He and I both had a big laugh over it.
And what I still wonder is, why are we living such a lie on this planet?
I can't answer that question. I agree with you.
Well, some people would say that power, arrogance, and greed were the strongest motivators of the last 60 years in suppressing information about non-human intelligences interacting with the planet.
I mean, I certainly can't disagree.
And what do you think will unfold between now and 2009 and going into the future? How long will these lies be perpetuated?
Until there's a dramatic event, which is probably an accident, or I don't think you're going to get anybody from the intelligence agencies to ever come forward. Those people are afraid to death.
What are they afraid of?
I can just say there's a very powerful force at work. Keep in mind, it's a very, very small number of people.
Who know?
That's correct. If you'll keep in mind, Eisenhower tried to get to the bottom of it. Jimmy Carter tried to get to the bottom of it. Bill Clinton tried to get to the bottom. Guess what?
All blocked.
That's what they say.
So who would be in control if presidents and prime ministers...
That's a question you have to answer yourself and tell me when you find out. A very select group.
Do you have any speculation?
I'd rather not comment.
One RAF Bentwaters Airman First Class who was in Rendlesham Forest on both the first night of December 26, 1980, and 2 nights later on December 28th was John Burroughs. The tantalizing rumor on base after December 1980 was that one or more military eyewitnesses saw John Burroughs either jump up on a craft in the forest or rise up into a beam of light. One of those that did describe seeing John rise in a red-orange beam of light was Adrian Bustinza, who fell on the ground next to John on the 28th. You have 45 minutes of missing time on the 26th, described by Lieutenant Moran, described by Jim Penniston, and John's memory is very confused. Then on the 28th, Adrian Bustinza at one point told John he saw him rise in a red-orange beam of light. John Burroughs was born in Bloomington, Illinois in 1960, same state as Jim Penniston, and joined the United States Air Force right after high school graduation. He received orders to go to RAF Bentwaters, England, and arrived in July 1979, about 18 months before the highly strange encounters with lights, beams, and craft in the Rendlesham Forest. During that time, John worked as an Air Force police officer and says nothing strange ever happened until the early morning of December 26, 1980, and the subsequent 45 minutes of missing time that neither John nor Jim Penniston can remember what happened. Right from the beginning, the men saw what they could not explain, and something happened to the minds of those eyewitnesses, either in the forest, in military interrogations later on, or both. The results have been blank or confused memories. These two men, Sergeant James Penniston and Airman John Burroughs, who were right next to each other in Rendlesham Forest on December 26th, do not remember the same details. It's my pleasure today to have John Burroughs with me to speak in his own voice and his own words from what he does remember about the lights that he saw, what happened after December 28th, that third night, that he saw also with his own eyes, and what he has learned from others who were there since he's been trying to organize a reunion back in Bentwaters next year. We have also tried to break through the memory block that he has about the 45 minutes of missing time with Jim Penniston on December 26th, and what did happen to him 2 nights later when Sergeant Adrian Bustinza says that he saw John rise in a red-orange light. So far, there has been no further hypnosis breakthrough, but like Jim Penniston, John Burroughs is nagged at night, still has trouble sleeping, and feels like, Jim Penniston feels like, that something is stirring in them right now, trying to remember. And I would like to introduce a colleague and a friend, John Burroughs.
Am I supposed to read this? Okay. Okay, thank you. Linda and I have been working over a year on the hypnosis part, and we tried last weekend to get a breakthrough, which didn't happen, but we decided 3 or 4 weeks ago that it might not hurt for me to come here and talk to you a little bit about the effects on me, Jim, explain some of the falsenesses that have come out over the years or statements that have maybe been misleading. So I'm going to go back from the very beginning, okay? I came on duty the night, Christmas night, December 25th. We worked 11 to 7, okay? We came on at 11, and after midnight on the morning of the 26th, and there's a discrepancy, or I don't even want to call it a discrepancy, there's a difference in some people's opinions of when it started. But if you look at my statement said it started at 3 o'clock in the morning. I remember it starting around 3 o'clock in the morning, okay? Some of the documentaries have shown me that I was stationed on the East Gate. The East Gate was not open, especially on holidays and weekends. I was on patrol driving around. My supervisor, who had just recently arrived at Bentwaters, Woodbridge, asked me to meet up with him and wanted to ride around with him for a while to get to know me a little bit better. It was a slow night, and so we got together and we started driving around. As we were driving down towards the East Gate, which was a check that we would do, because we would check around the perimeter. We were law enforcement, but we had some of our responsibilities was checking some of the perimeter fence lines and the East Gate, which was our post when it was manned. He noticed some strange lights out in the forest, just past the gate, and there was a road farther down, and it was just out into the edge of the forest. I'll be honest with you, at that point in time, it was late at night. I wasn't asleep, but I was tired. I wasn't really being observant. I was kind of talking to him, but he got really excited. Just, are those lights there? Are these normal? You've been here for a long time. So it got my attention. I looked out and I said, no. I said, I've never seen anything like this. Now, I've been there over 18 months. I've been on the gate at night. So right away, I want to get right into one thing. What we saw was not the lighthouse, okay? It was not the lighthouse going up and down in the trees or anything else. So the people that have come out and said that, I just, okay. Anyway, so we went down, opened the gate, we went down the road, and we got to the edge where you could go right or left. You could go left to Bentwaters, right towards another town, I believe it was Woodbridge Town. And I jumped out of the vehicle. When I got out of the vehicle, I looked into the woods. Immediately, and this was one of the few times I felt that way, I felt threatened. I felt there was something there that was making me nervous. Right away, I yelled into him. I said, this doesn't feel right. It was like a static electricity in the air. And both of us came concerned right away. We were off base. We hadn't told anybody that we were off base. What are we doing down there? So I jumped back in the car. We took off, went straight back up to the gate. Okay. We then went to the gate shack, and there was a gate shack there, and there was a phone that went directly to the law enforcement desk. I got on the phone. I told the guy what was going on. Well, I was a practical joker, so he didn't believe me. He had a real hard time dealing with what I was telling him, and he just figured I was fooling with him and everything. So long story short, I got transferred to CSC, okay, which is Central Security Control, which runs the security end of it. I explained what was going on to him, knowing that I've never played a joke on him. He took me somewhat serious because it was kind of hard to describe what we were seeing, just strange lights. So he called Staff Sergeant Penniston on the radio, and he responded down to the gate. The one thing that will always stick with me was Bud and I were real nervous because first we had been off base. Second of all, we could not understand what we were dealing with as far as what we were seeing. It didn't seem normal. How were we going to explain it? And he immediately over the radio broadcast responded down to the East Gate, which was on all the radio frequencies as far as for security, and they've spotted a UFO. Well, right away, Bud and I were like, oh no. Okay, and it's just like what Colonel Halt said, oh, okay, here goes a career. And I was just a young airman. And, you know, back then in 80, UFOs were looked at a lot differently than they are now, okay? And when you started trying to describe what a UFO was, people were looking at you like you were nuts, okay? So he came screaming down there. He met up with Steffens. We showed him what we were seeing, and then he got on the phone and started talking to CSC. Now, what he said to CSC and everything else I'm not really clear about because I wasn't there on the phone, but after he came off, a decision was made by the shift commander, and part of it was based on the fact that they contacted Eastern Radar. Now, over the years, stories have come out about that, and a lot of them have been tied towards the third night. Now, for a fact, and I've reconfirmed this with Lieutenant Brand and Sergeant Dillard, who was in CSC I just recently spoken to, there was some kind of radar contact. Now, when you talk to Lieutenant Brand, he's going to right away jump in, just like a lot of people do, and say, I'm not saying it was aliens or UFOs, I'm just saying there was something over the base that disappeared, okay? And that is why he sent us out there, because of the fact that there was some kind of strange lights in the woods, we couldn't explain what it was, and they had contact with Eastern Radar. So he was under the assumption that maybe something came down. Sergeant Steffens also felt, from his perspective, that maybe something had gone down in the woods. So it was decided that Sergeant Steffens and I and Airman Kabanzak would go into the woods. We went ahead and got in the pickup truck. We drove down. We made a right, went on a logging road as far as we could, and then we got out of the vehicle. Okay? From the very beginning, when you got out of the vehicle, it seemed strange in the woods. There was some strange activity as far as animals, noises, sounds. It didn't feel totally right in the woods. It felt strange. It just felt eerie. Okay, we started walking and we went over, I believe, if I remember right, a small creek because my feet got wet. But as we seemed to be trying to get closer to whatever it was, and we could still see it, okay, it seemed to be moving away, or we were having trouble zeroing in on where it was. Eventually, did you have a slide where you can show what I drew?
Yeah, there it is.
Okay, eventually, all of a sudden, and now this is where, and I'm going to go into this a little bit, Jim and I do not remember the same thing. Okay, and I've talked to Jim, and there were three of us that had the encounter. It was Penniston and I and Kabanzak. We were together. We were spread out in a line, okay? And we came into the clearing, and all of a sudden, it became a bright white light, and it almost blinded you. And it just startled us, and we hit the ground, okay? And whatever was there was just there briefly. And Jim was the closest to it, okay? And I was second, and Kabanzak was to my right. Okay, it wasn't there very long. It shot up and went back, okay? And it disappeared out into the distance, up in the trees and went back.
And John, that is the place that might be the 45 minutes of missing time when Jim was doing all of the photographing and everything, and in your mind, it may be seamlessly tied to the white flash.
It could very well be. So from there, we got up on our feet, and there's one little thing that has never really been talked about a lot, but it happened, okay? And Jim and I have talked about this, and he kind of remembers it, but he doesn't. At one point, when before we left the gate, it was decided we could not go off base with our weapons. There was a status enforcement agreement. We could go back and forth between posting with our weapons, but if we were going to go on an incident, we had to leave our weapons behind. That was a force agreement with the English government, and if anything you know about England, a little bit today they're carrying weapons more, but their police back then were not armed. Okay, so what we did was left our weapons, but somewhere in everything going on, it was decided, or what was passed on to Jim was that I could take out my sidearm. Okay, wasn't passed on to me because my weapon was left behind. But when Jim got close to it, there's two things that stand out that I'll stick by that Jim said from the very beginning. One, he ordered me to fire on it. He screamed out, fire on it. He felt it was a threat. I'm on the ground yelling, I don't have my weapon. And after you think about it, what would it have done anyway? Okay, not much, okay? Maybe I wouldn't be standing here today. But he immediately, and this is the one thing it's always been consistent. He immediately, and it's in Lieutenant Brand's statement, he immediately described it as some kind of craft. And it was like a triangular type craft. So from almost the very beginning, he made it clear on the radio when we were describing what happened and everything, he was describing it as an object. I and Cabanzac cannot describe it as that. I only can give you a little bit of an idea on what I drew as best I could, but it was always more like a light or an energy source.
Can you bring that slide back up?
It was more of an energy sort. There was a red and orange light type of light, and there was little blue lights in it with a big white light around it. But I do not remember it as being a triangular, but Jim did from the very beginning. At that point, we went out towards the area where it disappeared. Jim split up with us for a short time, and I'm not sure if, like you said, the white light flashing, or Jim had some other kind of little encounter. And then eventually Jim and I went forward farther because we were having a lot of trouble with our radios. They did lose radio contact with us for a while. And Cabanzac stayed back as a relay, and then he relayed back further to somebody else, okay? And that's pretty much what happened the first night. In my statement, it clearly states that as we went out further, we could see a beacon light, which we did follow it to see what it was, and it ended up being a lighthouse. But that was not what we saw at the beginning. And I'm going to be telling you truthfully, a lot of people have said they've seen the lighthouse from the gate. I never did. I never saw the lighthouse from the gate before. Some people said they did, but I never did. But I know what we saw in the woods hovering, going up and down, and what we encountered was not a lighthouse beam.
And John, Colonel Halt gets angry at even the suggestion that anybody could explain what he saw as a lighthouse.
Right.
Can you jump to the next day, which very few people have talked about, just briefly, on the 27th, what you learned about the female security guard, and then go to the 28th?
Okay. After we got off duty, I'm going to go through that real quick. We went back out into the woods, and we found some triangular patterns in the ground and some damage to the trees, which made it even harder on me because I want to summarize that. Jim and I could not clarify what we dealt with. We had no idea what it was, and we were really nervous about how it would affect us and our careers. I went home. I was on my first day of break, which would have been Friday. I went to bed that night, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and it's almost like what Jim said. I felt something had come back and something had happened. I got up. I went up to the base early in the morning. The on-duty flight the night before, when I went up there, was still on. The desk sergeant was finishing a report. In the report, there had been an incident that night of something else happening with strange lights in the woods. One of the things that he clarified to me was that the shift commander was a female. Her name was Tamplin. Had went out into the area where the lights were seen, and she had an object go through her vehicle. The vehicle shut down, and it completely upset her so much she had to be relieved of duty.
And it was a light
And it was the light
that went into the car.
that went through the vehicle, right? So she was relieved of duty because she should have been on duty the third night, which she wasn't, okay? But that's the only confirmation. I did see the report. He did say it to me, and I'm still working on some people that are not coming forward that are talking a little bit about that night. Now we go to the third night. After the first night and the second night, and I'd just been up on the desk, I went over to the dorm and found a couple of my friends, and after talking about the whole thing and the fact that I couldn't understand what was going on, we decided we're going to go back out in the woods that night. So I had no idea what was happening in the woods when I got there. We went out, we spent our day, we ate, we did some things, and that night we came onto the base, Woodbridge. We came through the front gate. One of the guys had a car, and when I came through the front gate, the gate guard said, "Hey, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, we're going out in the woods." He says, "Well, guess what? They're already out in the woods and stuff is already happening." So we went from there to the east gate. At that point, I tried to get out into the woods, and at first I was denied, and eventually I was allowed to go from the east gate to the area where they had the light-offs, and where I believe on Colonel Halt's tape he talks a little bit about they're doing an investigation, which was in the area of our first night. And one of the things that Colonel Halt talks about is that light beaming the beam of light down. I believe right before I was allowed to go forward and meet up with Colonel Halt's party, there was a blue light that actually came at us in that area, shot over the top of us, went behind me and a couple other guys, and there was the light-offs, and there was a pickup truck there. As it shot by the light-offs, and the light-offs were not working, the light-offs lit up and went back off. The light then shot through the pickup truck and then back up into the sky. Okay? From that point, I got permission to go forward and meet up with Colonel Halt and his party. One of the things that always stick out to me was the look on their faces. They were in shock. They weren't themselves. They were really shook up. They were a little bit rattled. The only one that really didn't seem to be that rattled was Lieutenant England. He was kind of crazy anyway. He was an ex-Marine. But he didn't seem to be as shook up. But the long story short on that was, eventually, Colonel Halt talked to me about what happened, asked me if some of what happened to him happened to me. he pointed out some of the blue lights flying around. And at one point, the blue lights, when he talked about beams of light going down onto the Bentwaters side, there was a blue light that was flying towards the weapons storage area, and I actually saw the light shoot down into that area too. Now, the difference between what people have said and other is I haven't found anybody yet that said it actually went into the area, okay, but there was a light that shot down in the area.
And that there were tapes that were being made in the
Right.
control towers that even Colonel Halt thinks
Right.
would have all the information about the fact that that would have been considered a national security threat of unidentified craft putting beams down in the weapons storage area.
Right, all our radio traffic was recorded that night. I believe the tape that Verano talked about that was taken by Williams over to Ramstein was the tape of the actual incident as it happened on radio, not a videotape. Everything was recorded on radio, so on that tape it'll describe what was going on all the different frequencies and everything that happened. I do know when that light came down in that area, there was activity inside the weapons storage area as far as radio traffic and things were being seen and things were happening.
John, can you go to when you are going with Adrian, the red-orange light,
Okay.
and what you remember?
Okay,
And then
sure.
what he told you?
Right. Shortly after the light over to the weapons storage area, a big type whitish orangish light appeared in the distance out towards the coast, off to the left of where we were. And Colonel Halt asked me, was that what I saw the first night? And it was sort of, but I kind of lied to him because I wanted to get out there and get closer to it. So I told him, I don't know, can I go look at it? And he reluctantly, but he did allow me to go forward. And the guy that went with me was Adrian Bustenza. And he was in uniform, I wasn't. We had a radio, and we started moving out towards it. As we started moving out towards this object, it started to appear to come closer to us. We were on the radio with the weapons storage tower, describing what was going on. And what I do remember is it got closer, we started running towards it, and I asked for permission, could I go up, could we get closer to it? Because we were moving quite a bit away from the people that were behind us. And he said, go for it. That's where everything happens. As we're going towards it and running, Adrian goes down to the ground. I keep running, and the next thing you know, I feel like I'm close to something, and then whatever it is there, and the next minute it's gone. But I'm standing there and it's gone in the field, and I don't know what happened. And then I turn around, and Bustenza's behind me, and I go back with him. And the one thing he told me at that moment was, he said, something pushed me to the ground and held me to the ground. And something happened to you with that object.
And later on, he told you what?
He said that I went into the object, and it appeared as though that something happened to me within the object.
And this was the red-orange light.
Yeah.
On December 28th.
Right.
And then on December 26th, 2 nights earlier, what you and Jim first saw were red, blue, white, and some yellow lights.
Right.
But when you got close to it, the only thing you can remember is the bright flash of light.
Yeah, the bright white, yellowish, orangish, right.
And 45 minutes of missing time, according to Lieutenant Baran and to Jim Penniston.
Yeah, well, Lieutenant Baran said they lost contact with us for 45 minutes.
Now, assuming there is a possibility, and we're still going to keep working on this, that you actually went into or up into whatever this red-orange light was, and we haven't been able to get into there yet, tell them what you saw with your own eyes after the night of the 28th.
Well, Friday, Saturday, Sunday was our days of break. When I came back to duty on Monday, okay, we were on swing shift, which was a 3 to 11 shift. I was posted on the east gate, and normally the east gate would close at 6, but they kept it open from all the way through 11. I was told I was put on the gate because of what had happened to me already, and there was going to be activity in the woods, and whatever happened, don't call it in over the radio. If you see something that you feel is a threat or something that you think is totally out of control, to pick up the phone and notify the control center.
And that was a way to control now information. They didn't want you to talk on the phone.
Right, and they definitely didn't. Well, they didn't want it over the radio. They didn't want anybody to know. And what was going on was there was helicopters that were going out into the area. There was, they actually were beaming some searchlights down, and there was trucks, vehicles going down in that area off the road and everything else. So there was a group of people out there in the forest. On the Sunday night prior, I was still up on the base. A C-5 came in at Bentwaters and landed and went back into a controlled area. And normally we would have security on it, but they had their own security. And I was told later that it came in, and it was part of what was going on in the woods on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. On Tuesday night when I was there, towards dusk, or a little, right around that time frame, the helicopter lifted something out, and it appeared to be a wooden crate, and it was brought over onto Woodbridge and landed out by the 67th, which is the pararescue area. Shortly afterwards, our squadron commander, General Williams, and Colonel Conray came through in separate vehicles and went to that area.
And there is so much more. I hope you can give a hand right now to John Burroughs for, after 30 years, talking. I'm going to finish with what Burroughs.
Okay, all right, okay.
Very good.
Thanks.
The RAF Bentwaters phenomena of December 1980 did not end on the 28th. 12 days later, on January 9th, 1981, Colonel Halt was back out in the Rendlesham forest along with his superior officers, General Gordon Williams and Base Commander Ted Conrad, but Colonel Halt did not include any details in his official January 13th, 1981 report that probably all of you in this room have read that report. And what I am now going to share with you from another security airman who was there, Colonel Halt has now confirmed everything is absolutely right, that he was back in Rendlesham Forest, and he did meet up with Ted Conrad, the base commander, and General Gordon Williams. Now, the man who was there at the East Gate of January 9th to January 10th, 1981, his name is Steve LaPlume. He was born in Leominster, Massachusetts on July 14th, 1962. Right after high school, he enlisted in the U.S. Air Force on July 10th, 1980. He first went to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas for technical training in the police academy, and then he was shipped out to RAF Bentwaters in mid-September 1980. He was still waiting for his secret clearance to come through so he could officially join the base security. In the meantime, Steve LaPlume was doing shift reliefs and remembers being in the day room soon after Christmas of 1980 when some airmen talked about other men chased by a UFO out in the Rendlesham forest. And then on the night of January 9 to 10, 1981, which would be about 11 or 12 days later, Airman First Class Steve LaPlume was on patrol at the RAF Woodbridge East Gate with Senior Airman Wendell Palmer. And he sketched himself that this is what they first saw. He said, "We were watching a light moving up and down in the sky over many degrees like a sewing machine needle. They called security control, and to their shock, General Gordon Williams, Base Commander Ted Conrad, who brought his wife and children with him, and Deputy Base Commander Charles Halt showed up with cameras to photograph the UFO that had returned to Rendlesham Forest. Steve LaPlume told me he and Airman Palmer, quote, knew something was up when the officers seemed to know where to go because they jumped into a military car and headed to Rendlesham Forest, close quote, without much discussion with Palmer and with LaPlume. About 45 minutes later, the officers returned to the East Gate, said they didn't see anything, and posted Palmer and LaPlume on the East Gate all night long, asking the two security men to report anything else that might happen. And then all of the officers with the family members left. At the East Gate, Airman LaPlume and Palmer saw a blue, green, red, and yellow light come straight for them over Rendlesham Forest. At its closest above them, they could see what they described as a huge cigar-shaped aerial craft, perhaps 300 feet long and 1,000 feet above their heads.
This craft was maybe about 1,000 feet off the ground, and it just seemed like a huge cigar shape. And when it got over us, I remember seeing some lights underneath, I remember seeing it was a structure, and there was like a square hatch-looking thing. I was pretty sure I was looking at the UFO. And then the craft started moving towards the right, went up in elevation, went up in clouds, and turned into one of the stars, and that was the last we saw of it. Palmer looked at me, and I looked at him, and he said, "Do you want to call that in?" And I said, "Hell no," and he said, "Okay." And we never really talked about it again after that. We never told anybody about it, because we didn't want the ridicule and all the other BS that was going to come down on us.
How long do you think that you and Palmer watched it close above you?
Well, I'd say from the time it took when I realized it wasn't an airplane and it was over the forest to the time it got to where we were standing and over our heads would have taken maybe 20 seconds. And then when it was over our heads, I don't think it was over our heads 10 seconds.
So at least a 30-second sighting, and then what happened to it?
And then it moved off towards our right and went up into the sky slowly, maybe about a 25-degree angle, and it just climbed in elevation and eventually went from something that looked like a craft to something that looked like a star and faded in with the stars. This was, not of this earth. Nothing that I'd seen could come close to what this craft was doing.
And then what are the implications?
Yep, here we are 30 years later. We still have no clear answers of what's going on. I mean, when you have crafts flying over nuclear weapons storage areas and nobody seems to have a grip on what they are, you'd think that'd be kind of important.
And why did the governments remain so silent?
I think just utter fear that they couldn't. What are they going to tell the people? Something's flying over our nukes and we have no control over it?
And there, I think, is a bottom line about the reality of Bentwaters. And when you look back over the last 30 years and you realize that it was someone with a capital S concerted effort to try to convince the world public long ago that it was a lighthouse, and you had 36 trained security military men, one of which has talked to you today about what he can remember in his mind, and that we know that there were distortions, what appeared to be a feeling of time was slowing down when the men were out in the forest, that Bentwaters is, in my estimation, if not the most important, one of the most important cases involving more eyewitnesses and an interaction with something that was clearly not human technology than perhaps any other case that I know. And we are going to continue trying to hopefully penetrate his memory, and Jim Penniston over the next few months may also try to work on his memory, and that I hope maybe in a year from now we will be able to have more information about this extraordinary case. And Ryan, I don't know if we have any time for any questions. If we could.
Time, we just need a microphone.
And John, you could come up and join me. And I hope that you have appreciated this sharing today.
Linda, wasn't there actual contact between military people and these aliens? I heard rumors that military were seen meeting with aliens in Rendlesham Forest.
I'll give a brief, what I know, and I was not there, John was, but John's memory is clearly not clear, and neither is Penniston's. I have talked with Lieutenant Baran, who said, Linda, the only people who knew what happened, and he was the shift commander and he was not out there in the woods, he said to me, are the men who are out there. But I too have heard the Larry Warren story and others about perhaps the night of the 27th being an interaction with beings. And there may have been other interactions on that night, the 28th, because they did have light-alls out there and they did have cameras. Now, I think of it as being perhaps informed but not proven testimony, and I'd be very curious myself what John would say about the idea, did you ever hear when you were there? any rumors after the 27th or the 28th about anybody having encountered entities?
I think I've got one.
Okay, go ahead.
As far as, are you asking, was there alien contact? I don't think anybody knows for sure. I mean, it's no different than like what happened with me. I know something happened to me when I got close to the object. There's been a lot of rumors flashed around, and I think that's the most important thing of why I'm trying to get everybody back together. The easiest way to solve the issue of the rumors and what really happened is to put us back together and let us all talk about our experiences and what we remember. Because like I said, it's clearly that Jim and I have a different perspective of what happened to us, and we were maybe 5 or 6 feet apart.
Yeah.
Peter Robbins co-wrote a book, Left at East Gate. You haven't mentioned Larry Warren in your talk, and I'm wondering what the involvement of Larry Warren was in this incident, if you know.
Larry Warren, it's been confirmed that he was on the flight that was on duty that night. It's been confirmed that, or I shouldn't say confirmed, but there's a good chance he had some kind of involvement with it. Again, I'm going to go right back to what I just said before. Different people have seen different things. There's a whole other issue that came up afterwards that we were brought in and interrogated, and different things happened to us from there. So who knows what was planted in people, what their true memories totally are, and everything else. So as far as it goes with Larry right now, the best thing is to say is you have to listen to a story and make a decision yourself on whether you believe or don't believe.
And I can make a personal footnote here. I interviewed Larry Warren with Ben Jameson, a mathematician. John Burroughs knows Ben as well, back in 1986, and I still have approximately 7 or 8 audio tapes. And this was done privately with just the 3 of us in a room, and Larry Warren at the time asked us not to use the audio tapes. And Peter is here, and Peter may have something he would comment, but I'm just going to say what Larry told us in that private recording session back in 1986. Larry said, I went back to my dorm room and I could hear a man sobbing. And I went down the hall and it was Adrian Bustinza on his bunk. And he was sobbing hard. And I sat down on the bed next to him and I said, what is wrong, Adrian? And Adrian began to download to Larry Warren about being out in the forest, the story you've heard from John, and that he later was given some kind of an underground debriefing with a few other people in an auditorium in which they felt like that they could not move their heads or their bodies, and that there was a scrim on a stage, and that a being that did not look human came and waddled, I remember his using the word waddled, out behind the scrim, and that they had telepathic downloads in their head about how the Catholic Church was concocted and how wars were allowed for human entertainment. And that Adrian, being a very strict Catholic, was falling apart at this knowledge, allegedly, that the Catholic Church was concocted, implied by the non-humans. I've always thought about that, and I don't have any bad feelings about sharing that today in 2009, but I've never shared that before this moment. And I think that we are reaching a period of time where there is an awful lot of information inside an awful lot of people that is being suppressed, and myself included. And that in this case, Larry Warren said that he promised Bustinza, who was sobbing, that he would take Bustinza's story and take it on as his own. And I'm not here to say that is the full truth or the whole truth. I'm just saying this was very complicated, and there were an awful lot of traumatized people, from Adrian Bustinza to John Burroughs to Jim Penniston, and probably Larry Warren. And that we have an event that did not stop on the 28th. If you have all the commanders on a base rushing out to Rendlesham Forest on January 9th, that means that there had to have been other briefings about what was going on between the 28th and January 9th as well. And there may have been briefings underground, and Adrian Bustinza might have been exposed to something that John and Jim Penniston and others were not. This is the area where we still have lots of work to do.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I just want to take these three people that have lined up with quick questions.
Very quick question about sounds. John, at any time did you hear any sound from either the craft or the lights? Did you ever hear tree limbs breaking? And you mentioned earlier that there were strange sounds of animals on the first night when you went out. Would you describe that in a little more detail, please?
The animals were like a screeching sound. It clearly sounded like they were upset. Something had startled them, and it sounded like they were moving. And it was actually a farmer's field where there was livestock in there. I believe it was dairy cattle. The rest of it, no, there was really no noise. There was never a distinct noise or anything like that. It was the colors that you saw that affected you, not the noise.
And the hair, you and Jim.
Well, yeah, and then the hair, the static electricity, and the feeling of slow motion. It seemed like whenever you got close to it, when you got close to what it was, both times, I feel like everything was slowing down and going into really like a warped, distorted type of effect.
Interesting.
Yep.
Since the time that this event happened, have you had any medical checkups where anything was noticed differently? Have you been checked for radiation or implants? Have you personally noticed any differences in your bodily functions? Not getting too graphic, of course.
No, don't worry about that.
But in the way of your thinking, you said you used to be a practical joker. Has that changed? Those types of things. I'd like to know more about medically how anything has changed in you.
Okay. There was some medical effects that happened not only to me but some of the others. One of the things that happened with me shortly after the incident, I started getting sick. My throat, I had throat problems. At one point, my gums turned white. Shortly after I deployed our PCS back to the States, I was still having health issues, and I got sick one night, and I went to the emergency room, and one of the things that they found was that I had a heart murmur. Now, I didn't have a heart murmur when I came in the Air Force, okay? I couldn't have come in the Air Force if I had a heart murmur. There was a lot of testing done. I had vision problems. There was white type spots in my eyes. When the incident happened, when it broke, when Larry Warren got it stirred up and got it out, a bunch of us were moved. And my assignment, I was selected to go to Korea. And I was having the medical issues at the time. There was a doctor there that didn't want me to go over there, and I still got sent over there. So yes, I've had vision. My mouth turned white, and it appears there's a good shot that I was exposed to radiation. And that's one of the things that I've talked to a doctor about. There is supposedly a way that they can determine through your liver if you ever were exposed to a high dose of radiation. And that's something that maybe down the line I'd like to pursue.
Okay, thank you. Tom, last question.
John, it's extraordinary. You're a brave man. Standing up and talking to a bunch of people, of course, being a brave man sometimes. You mentioned, but did not elaborate, on the plane that landed, a large plane, perhaps bringing in a group.
Right.
And here's what I would offer. That means there are potentially an entire other group of people who might be interviewed, who might know what happened. And you'd have to ask the question of why bother? You were professionals. You would do what you were told to do. There had to have been some reason that somebody or something was sent in.
I think they're called MJ-12.
I hate to do science fiction, and Linda, you know my background. This is absolutely against it. If I were the guy in Washington making a decision, you know what I would have done? I wouldn't have sent a fancy piece of equipment. I would have sent my captured or friendly or allied alien to talk to whoever was visiting you.
Okay. Do you want me to expand on the plane and what happened?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here's something
Focus on
that's
the
come
plane,
up, and Colonel Halt has actually confirmed this. And there's an individual by the name of Robert Hastings that's done a lot of work on nuclear weapons and what's happened there. So I'm gonna have to go around in a circle here, but hypothetically, what was at Bentwaters was affected, okay? And what I mean by that is, you can read between the lines, but something allegedly happened to something inside the weapons storage area, And Colonel Halt has now just confirmed to me, and Hastings has found the same individual, and he talked to him, that there was actually some kind of effect done on a couple objects that were stored in the weapons storage area, and they were removed and taken back to Kirkland Air Force Base. So you can read between the lines on that. Now, the team that came in was involved in that. They were also out in the woods. So what it appeared to me with what was going on was they were looking into what happened. You know, there was no, I was never brought in and interrogated, so there was no like interrogation going on, but they were actually doing an investigation on what happened to us and what we saw.
And one other thing, even though we can't sort this out, you have talked with the assistant controller, Donnie Dillard,
Yes.
who said that briefly a helping hand was put out an alert, which has to do with interaction with the nuclear weapons storage area. But Lieutenant Moran says no.
Right.
But it's possible that there might have been a short alert in helping hand.
Well, the way it's explained to me from Sergeant Dillard was it was declared. Colonel Halt verified to me through email that he felt something may have been declared, but it was never put down in writing, which is kind of hard to explain. But I will go on this note. From beginning to end, the involvement of the staff and what happened did not follow protocol. And there was a lot of questions why. And the one thing that always stuck out with me was CNN, Chuck DeCarlo did a piece on this. Somebody from the Pentagon came over when he aired the piece, and one of the things they were looking at is they could not, when he went in there and reviewed everything, was they were trying to find out why protocol wasn't followed either.
Hey, thank you very, very much.
Okay. Can I get out of this?